Morning, everybody. Hope you're all well. Today we continue with Mark chapter 3. Hope you have found the previous studies on the same book to be interesting. As I prepared this lesson, it was also insightful because I think sometimes we forget the things that are recorded, and different writers even record, even though it's the same event, they record it slightly differently. Every time we read the same passage, but in different books, we sometimes draw different insights. So it has been helpful for me to prepare this lesson. When I look at Mark chapter 3, at least in the first few passages, I see a few things, right? So, firstly, Jesus is watched. And interestingly, we sang the song, Watching You, just now, right? I remember singing that song in Klang congregation probably 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's a meaningful song, and glad we could, sing it again. When we look at, for example, the first 6 verses, we see that Jesus was watched closely. Let's read that. And he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely. Now just pay attention to who is the day they are referring to, yeah? Whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So they again. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. Then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved with the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, that they might destroy him. Right? So if you look from verse 2 and verse 6, the they is actually referring to the Pharisees, right? How they were watching him closely so that they might entrap him and accuse him. And then when Jesus did what they expected him to do, which is to heal on the Sabbath, then their intent was to actually destroy him, to kill him. Right? So let's look at some things worth observing from this text. As I said, that's now Jesus was closely watched, right? That's a good thing, because if anyone is seeking to know more about God, you want to know more about his teachings, you want to be closely watching what Jesus is saying, what he is doing, right? So the audience there in the synagogue wouldn't just have been the Pharisees. The Pharisees would be there, but there would be the general public as well, right? Who would be at the synagogue observing Jesus. And if and because Jesus already had this was not his first miracle, right? So Jesus had healed people before. So if Jesus comes to the synagogue or goes anywhere for that matter, his reputation is likely to have preceded him, right? So he would, people would know, oh, Jesus is here, or Jesus is coming. He's the one who can heal, right? So there will be people in the general public who will be watching for that. And necessarily, if you are someone who has a family member, a friend, somebody who at that time, let's say, is not well, cannot be treated through normal means, right, by medication, by doctors of the day, this would be your avenue for healing, right, for restoration. And it wouldn't be surprising that people would anticipate watching, just be amazed by the things that Jesus could do, as well as to seek treatment either for themselves or for others, right, in this kind of situation. So people were there watching Jesus, right? Today a lot of the trade that we do, that we see happening around us, is learned that way. You don't go to school necessarily to learn how to mix a pile of cement and plaster a wall. At least not in Malaysia, right? You learn it on the job, right? If you are an electrician, a plumber, quite similarly, there are schools vocational schools that teach that, but for the most part, you go with experienced contractor, experienced electrician, plumber, and they will teach you how you do it, right? This is what you do to remove it. These are the tools that you need. These are the steps that you take to do whatever you need to do, to repair whatever you need to repair. So observation is definitely how people learn, and we can learn a lot through observation. So let's not underestimate um, tutelage, right, or pupillage. So as we see people, experience people doing things, um, it will be worthwhile for us to learn from them. And I think some of the things that we encourage in this respect is when one-to-one classes happen, right? So if you've not had a one-to-one class with a non-believer before, there are always one-to-one classes happening upstairs every Sunday. So reach out to a teacher and sit in. You don't have to prepare any lesson. You don't have to prepare to say anything, right? At least in the beginning, right? Join and see how the classes are conducted, how the teachers run the class, and you'll be surprised. It's not very difficult. It's quite standardized once you get into the flow, and of course you have to prepare beforehand. But that's how people learn, and that's how Christians can learn as well. And of course, conversely, if we don't pay attention to what Jesus has to say, what he's doing, then he will have no meaning and usefulness to us. So those in the day, if they were not at the temple, they were not bothered by Jesus, they heard of his message, they never bothered to listen to it attentively, never bothered to go and see him, never bothered to engage him in conversation, or even with his disciples, it will mean nothing to them, even if Jesus had the wealth of the world to offer, right? And Jesus has the wealth of eternity to offer, right? So unless people pay attention and take heed, it will mean nothing to them. As we look at the scenario that's now at the synagogue, there will be many people, many different groups of people, many people from different backgrounds, many people from different places. They would be, I would guess, for the most part, ordinary people of the town and the surrounding areas that have heard of Jesus, right? Because Jesus has been performing miracles. We read about that in Mark 1, Mark 2, and as we start Mark 3, a miracle was about to be performed right there and then. So the word of Jesus, power to heal, right? His ability spread everywhere, because it was something that people of the day had never seen, and they could not obtain from other sources, right? So he was special. So as I mentioned just now, if people had relatives or they themselves had trouble that couldn't be healed by doctors and medicine of the day, Jesus would be the avenue. Remember this from Mark 2, right? The prior chapter in verse 1 and 12, where the Bible records that Jesus was in Capernaum and he was in a house. And what happened was that when the people of the town knew that he was in the house, they came and flooded the whole house. So there was no space anymore. And then they wanted to bring a paralytic, right? So this guy was paralyzed in some way, couldn't move by himself. And 4 people, the Bible says, 4 men, carried him up to the top of the house, opened the roof, and lowered the paralytic down to where Jesus was. So because of Jesus' reputation to heal, as well as to teach, of course, in this case, they were likely because they wanted Jesus to see this man and to heal him. And the only way that they thought Jesus could heal him was to bring the paralytic right up to Jesus himself, right? So the only way in was through the roof, and Jesus healed him as well as forgave him of his sin. Similarly, we see that Jesus healed, for example, later in Mark 3, 7 and 8, says this, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and beyond the Jordan, and those from Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude. So his reputation to heal definitely has preceded him, and people would know of his special ability. And when they heard how many things he was doing, came to him. And then in verse 10, we read that they sought healing just by, hopefully, Jesus touching them, right? Because he could heal that way, just by touch. But Jesus' ability to heal, as we know it, is not limited by touch alone, right? We know that he could, for example, speak, and a miracle would happen. In Matthew 8:32, the account is given of demon-possessed man, And when the demons saw Jesus approaching, they asked Jesus if they could go to the flock of sheep nearby. And Jesus said, go, right? And it happened, right? So the demons themselves were fearful of Jesus and they sought his permission, right? Matthew 8:30-32. Now a good way off from them. This was not a flock of sheep, swine, right? They were the record is of swine, right? So the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, permit us to go into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." And so when they had come, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea and perished in the water. Right? Jesus could also heal from a distance. Right? He did not necessarily have to be there for a miracle to happen. This is the record of the nobleman's son in John 4:46-54. And the record says this: So Jesus came again to Cana of Galilee, where he had made the water wine. And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. Capernaum, from where Jesus is, in Cana, is about 27 to 32 kilometers away. It's not far, but it's not near either. And when he heard that he came out of Judea into Galilee, he went to him and implored him to come and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. And Jesus said to him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will by no means believe." The nobleman said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your son lives." So the man believed the word of Jesus, the word that Jesus spoke to him, and he went his way. And as he was now going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Your son lives." So an instance of Jesus healing from a distance. Now, what's the relevance of this? Right? Is there a connection that we can learn, or something that we can learn from these events? What we notice is the healing, first of all. The healing is not something that hard to identify. It's not a discomfort in the pain, in the leg, in the body. It's not a headache. It's visible, right? It's serious. It cannot be healed through normal medication, for example, right? A headache, a stomachache, some of it could be temporary. Taking some medicines, letting time pass, it will heal. If you are demon possessed, if you are paralyzed, if you are dead, you can't come back. You cannot restore yourself. Doctors cannot do anything. The process of time will not make things better. This was unique in terms of what Jesus could do. Contrast that with what we see today as faith healing. Do we see people being healed in the sense of the same significance and magnitude of what Jesus did? Healing a paralyzed person, raising someone who has died, healing someone basically of something that is impossible through modern medicine and the body's natural ability to recover. A lot of people now claim this, but if it was indeed true in our day and age, where social media can bring news around the world in less than an hour, right? This would be the latest news, right? It would not be whatever's happening in Davos or in China. It would be people are getting healed because so and so can heal, right? Unfortunately, this is not spreading like wildfire. Such news is sometimes only confined to the particular church or congregation. Why is that? We have to ask ourselves the question. And sometimes, today's modern faith healers, there's this condition of faith, right? So if you're not getting well, they say you don't have enough faith. But as we saw, the nobleman's son was almost dying, was not in front of Jesus. He's not recorded to be someone who has faith in Jesus. The Father had the faith, right? So the faith in itself is not a precondition of healing, right? Many instances of miracles you will note may have a need for faith, but it also is not necessarily always ever a requirement. Let's move on to teaching on the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 6, the Bible tells us that the day, right, they were the Pharisees, they were watching him, whether he would heal on the Sabbath. And if he did, then they would want to accuse him of breaking the commandment of rest on the Sabbath. Why did the Pharisees respond that way? Well, because amongst others, Jesus had not followed the law of the Sabbath, which is of rest. And if you can recall last week's lesson at the end of chapter 2, Jesus was already talking about this question about the Sabbath. And Jesus was addressed this with the disciples as they were walking through the grain fields on the Sabbath. And at that time, the Pharisees had already asked him, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath, to pluck and to eat? Mark 2:24 is the passage, and Jesus responded by giving two examples, that of David, whom the Jews know and respected, right? And that David took holy bread from the temple, meant only for the priests to eat, because it was a desperate situation, and he gave it to those who were with him also. And that's 1 Samuel 21, 1-6. And Jesus was telling the Pharisees that it was not unlawful when David did so. Jesus also said in Mark 2:27, just the prior chapter, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Meaning, the Jews, when they see this requirement of resting on the Sabbath, they need to understand that the Sabbath is not something that they have to be beholden to at all costs. So that even if one was hungry, one could not pluck food to eat, right? And as a result, he would die, right? That is not the interpretation that they should have. And that's why Jesus then asked them a question in the Mark 3 account, right? Saying, is it wrong to do good rather than to do evil, right? That means if you have to do something good, are you telling me it is wrong to do it on the Sabbath? The Pharisees were silent because the answer to that was, yes, if it is necessary to do good, we should be able to do it, right? But because if they were to answer yes, then they would be, they don't do it, right? They don't do good on the Sabbath. They prohibit everything to be done on the Sabbath. And that's why they remain silent, because it would implicate them. Later in Mark 7, a few chapters down, we read of Jesus again with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were accusing Jesus and his disciples of eating food with unwashed hands. In verse 3 of Mark 7, there is a special way of washing hands, which the Pharisees insist. And the Jewish and Jesus' disciples did not wash their hands in this special way, right? The record says this: for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding to the tradition of elders. Then in verse 6 and 7, we read Jesus' response. He answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy against you hypocrites, for it is written, these people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So Jesus called these additional requirements, right? You got to wash your hand in a particular way. You can't help people and do any good thing even on the Sabbath. He called this the traditions, right? Teaching as commandments, the traditions of men, right? So these were traditions and practices that the people of the day decided to add on to their faith. And then it became equivalent to God's law. Do you see a parallel in this today? I don't know whether you do. But if you think closely, I've encountered this before, particularly because we are Chinese, right? So if you, for ladies especially after giving birth, you before you give birth, I'm sure you'll be told by a lot of people, right, that after you give birth, you cannot wash hair, cannot bathe, cannot go out. For how long? 30 days, right? If you come to church before 30 days, don't be surprised somebody asks you, hey, 30 days already, right? Or if you if you look good, they probably know you bathe, right? So don't be surprised you get confronted with this, right? This is actually a tradition, right? A ritual, a practice of certain cultures and ethnicities. Well, as long as the mother and the child are not ready to come for whatever reason, sometimes it's a difficult operation, the child is still not well, totally fine. If you can't come as a parent and you can't bring your child, because necessarily when you have a newborn, you don't just leave your newborn at home, right? Because the newborn needs to be fed every hour, every 2 hours or so. So, that may be a challenge, right? So if you can't bring the child for whatever reason, even if it's more than a month, I think it's fine, right? But if you have recovered and after 1 week plus, you're well, you're doing the things that you have to do at home independently already, there's really no reason to not be coming to church, right? If we do make that a reason, everything is well, but because it's not 30 days yet, it's only 29, I'll come next week, then we will be doing very much what is being practiced by the Pharisees in terms of the interpretation of the law of keeping the Sabbath holy, right? So let's look at our lives, right? Let's look at the things around us. Are we adding to the doctrines, the commandments of men, the commandments of our forefathers, right? Maybe there's a context to that, right? Nobody denies it. Maybe those rules were 200-300 years ago. They came from China. Weather can be quite cold, right? You don't want to take a bath in cold water necessarily, right? You don't want to expose a baby to the environment outside. Maybe it was a plague. Maybe there was sickness running around. So if the child falls sick, not much immunity can die. There are many reasons for why practices come into play, right? But we need to know those. If they are because of those reasons, if they don't apply now, then they don't apply, right? We don't blindly follow rules, right? More so to put them in such a high status that they become God's law, right? And that's what the Pharisees did. They took their traditions to the ultimate limit and regarded them as law, and they even questioned Jesus and his disciples about why they did not follow it. So that angered the Pharisees. But Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees was not just this particular incident. They were not just unhappy with him because he healed people on the Sabbath. They were unhappy with him because Jesus had always been very critical of him, right? Of them, because they were, in a sense, as he would call them, hypocrites, right? As we just saw just now in Mark 7, verse 6, right? These people and he answered them and said, "Well, did Isaiah prophesy to you, hypocrites?" Right? So he was addressing the Pharisees that they were hypocrites. So Jesus has been very critical of the Pharisees because of the way they teach people, the way they live their lives. They were not right. In last week's lesson, we spoke about that as well. The Pharisees questioned Jesus in verse 15 and 17 of chapter 2, why he was eating with tax collectors. The Jews as a whole, they hate tax collectors, right? And these would be Jewish tax collectors who collected taxes for the Roman government, and they would be able to keep some of that as their fee. And sometimes these people were dishonest, they would collect more for themselves. So they were hated as being traitors, as being dishonest people. Verse 15 says this, "Now it happened as he was dining in Levi's house," Mark 2:15, that many tax collectors and sinners also sat together with Jesus and his disciples. For there were many, and they followed him. Right? So there were many tax collectors who followed Jesus. Right? And when the scribes and Pharisees saw him eating with the tax collectors and sinners, they said to his disciples, "How is it that he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard it, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Right? So every time Jesus does something, the Pharisees are always out to get him. And Jesus, in this instance, explained, right, to the Pharisees as well as to his disciples who were there, that he is there because these are the people who need to know about God's saving grace and to live righteous lives. Right? It's not just those who know the law. So the Pharisees' encounter with Jesus never generally ended well. And Jesus will also not just rebuke the Pharisees face to face, Jesus will also tell the multitude about the Pharisees, right? So, for example, in Matthew 23, 1 to 3, then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observe and do, right? But do not do according to their works, for they say and do not do," right? So this was a hit at the Pharisees and the scribes, that while they teach the right thing, don't follow their action, because their actions sometimes are wrong. But as we have saw in Mark 3, some of the things they teach also is incorrect, yeah, because their interpretation of the Sabbath, what can or cannot be done, is not right, with the scripture. It's not consistent with the scriptures. Interestingly, if you actually go and um, do a search, right, a Google search on Sabbath rules, for example, you'll be surprised what you can and cannot do today. So among practicing Jews, um, what is the understanding of the Sabbath, right? So there's a lot of automation that has taken place to circumvent these rules, for example, right? So there are many rules, for example, about cooking. So you have to eat on the Sabbath, right? On the Saturday, you have to eat, but you can't cook. You're not allowed to start a fire, and you can't turn something from one form into another. So raw form to cook form, you can't. So there are ways to manage that. If you Google, you can find them. You can't on a switch, for example. So they have to use automation to turn that things on from the day before, right? So very interesting. And that has probably evolved from the things that were written as we saw it just now, the traditions of how Sabbath is to be interpreted until modern time, right? How modern life has to now also take into account all these rules that people have come up with, the Jews have come up with, pertaining to what is work and what is not work. Another observation we can make is that those who are not sincere to listen and learn about Jesus, those who follow traditions and treat them like law, just as the Pharisees, will not be able to appreciate the significance of Jesus' words and actions, even though they are listening to the same message. We all listen to the same message that is delivered from a pulpit, for example. But sometimes we see different responses, right? Some people go away after a lesson questioning the teacher, what was said by the teacher. Doesn't make sense. This happens, right? Some people go away reflecting and realizing, oh, that's something I need to change. So that's good, right? There's a reflection, there's an acceptance of what the Bible says, the connection to their lives, they desire to make a change. But the first group, if they're critical, they never really get the message. And now the problem is the teacher, right? The Pharisees are in this first group, right? They're sitting, they're watching, they see something great happening, but what is their response? Go kill Jesus. When someone can heal and make someone who is incapacitated or even dead recover, right? Someone with the concerns that we see, the health issues that we see, not normally recoverable by health or by medicine, but by time or medicine. What would you do in those situations? I think you would want to take Jesus around the world and help as many people, right? Today we'll do this city, next tomorrow we'll do that city, and we'll tell the cities in advance, Jesus is coming, bring only your sick people because we don't have time for this, right? But because Jesus also needs to teach, maybe they'll schedule another time, right? Come at this time after that or before that to listen to the message. Then there will be healing, right? But instead of the Pharisees, for example, facilitating Jesus' travels, Jesus' preaching, Jesus' healing to influence as many as possible, what did they do? They want to kill him, right? A really odd reaction. And this is what happens when we are not rational and we are not sincere with wanting to listen to God's message. So the end result can be we bring more harm to ourselves than the message is intended to do. The message is intended to change, but we cause harm, not just for ourselves in this instance, sometimes can influence others as well, maybe even the immediate family of these Pharisees. Then in verse 5, the Bible talks about the hardness of heart, and how Jesus was grieved by that. The message is hearts need to be soft, meaning hearts need to be receptive to the truth, regardless of what it has to say. Right? So whether we like it or not, we have to receive it. Whether it's painful and difficult to follow, we have to follow. So Jesus was sad when he saw that they didn't listen to him, when the miracles and the signs that he was performing meant nothing to the Pharisees. So he was grieved, he was angry, and he called them having hard heart. Right? Today, if we are not receptive to the message, we will be people who grieve Jesus, right? Because the message never gets in. Our hearts are not receptive to the truth, either through stubbornness, right? As in we refuse to admit that we are wrong, so we don't care what the Bible says, or inattentiveness. Sometimes a lot of things are being taught and said, but nobody's really listening. That won't help us either, right? At least in the Pharisees' instance, they were paying attention to what Jesus was saying. They were paying attention to what was happening, but it didn't help them because of their heart. Today, there's so many things that are distracting to us. If we do not remove them from our lives, then our inattentiveness will also have the same outcome for us. In verse 22, we read that the scribes came from Jerusalem. They came to Jesus when he was with the multitudes, and they said Jesus was Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons, and he cast out demons because he was the ruler of the demons. The scribes is now a different group of people. They are another learned and respected people of the law. And Beelzebub is a pagan god. So calling Jesus Beelzebub was derogatory, was not a compliment. And they were telling the people that Jesus could heal because he is the leader of these demons. To which Jesus responds in verse 23 and 27 of Mark 3 is that a kingdom divided on itself cannot stand. That means if these people were my followers, if the demons were my followers, I wouldn't block them. Otherwise, how are they going to do their work, right? We are divided. If I tell them to go and do this and then I block them or I stop them, it just doesn't make sense, right? And in the analogy, Jesus gives the account of a thief coming to steal, right? It's not logical for a thief to steal from his own master, another thief, right? And then when he can steal from someone else, it just would not make sense. So to be successful, he has to bind. The incident is, if you're trying to steal from someone who is strong, you must first bind the guy, right? You got to tie the guy up. You won't tell him in advance you're coming to steal from him. Right? It wouldn't make sense. So the lesson here is that sometimes it's not the position of the person that will determine the truth. These were, like I said, learned people of the law, scribes, right? You would expect that they know what the law says, but Jesus rebutted them. The scribes, although they were experts, they were not making sense, and Jesus contradicted them with this parable. So the question for us is, are we impressed? And do we elevate and respect people because they are learned, because they are smart, they are successful, they are prominent, they are rich? And solely because of that. Because the scribes, in a sense, were in that position because of the fact that they were scribes. Right? The standard really is not the degrees, the education in the sense that they have, or one has, even today, or how successful they are in their careers, or how prominent and rich they are. It is about how close they are in their understanding and in their deeds to Jesus' teaching. If they cannot even understand the simple truth, if they are contradicting what the Bible has recorded, they are not people that should be highly regarded at all. So just holding a position can be damaging for the individual and for others. Putting the right people in the right position, therefore, is important. The scribes did not speak the truth. And fortunately, the multitude did not give heed to their commands and arguments. about Jesus casting out demons because they were their leader. When we look at a few other verses, um, like the prior passages in Mark 3, we see the names of disciples being called out. Not all their vocations are listed, right? Some are. For example, we know Matthew is a tax collector. We know Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen. So from Jesus' point of view, and the rest we don't see them listed, yeah. But among the writers of the books, we know, for example, they were very learned people like Luke, who was a physician. We know of Saul, who was a Pharisee who became the apostle Paul, right? So, but for the most part, we see a balance, right, of educated and non-educated people. So Jesus' criteria, when he looked at people, was not their position. It's very likely their heart, right, more than anything else. So if they happen to hold low level positions, blue collar job positions, so be it. It was not the criteria, right? If they happen to be doctors, learned people, that would not be the criteria. It's because their hearts are right, that God could use them, that Jesus could use them. That's why they were selected. So similarly, when we look at, for example, the appointment of elders and deacons, one's vocation, one's education, one's social standing, one's wealth is not the criteria. In fact, it's never mentioned as part of the criteria in the first place, right? The criteria are all attributes that are related to a spiritual life, about the person's leadership at home, about the person's faith and spiritual ability. So when we look at, for example, Samuel, when he was told to appoint the next king of Israel, he first made the mistake of seeing one of the sons of Jesse and thinking this is the chap that's going to be the next king, because he looked like the guy, right, who would be king. To which God told him, 1 Samuel 16, 6-7. So it was when they came that Samuel, looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him." Although physically Eliab looked the part of being the king, God said he's not the man. Very likely the person on who Eliab was did not have the characteristics God was looking for. He could have been a proud individual. He could have been a self-centered person. He was not maybe as godly and as sacrificial from a spiritual sense as God would have wanted his king to be. Then God said, "For the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So it is the inner person that God considers, and we need to learn that, right? So prominent positions in the synagogue, in the temple, and even in the church today have more to do with the person's personal spiritual standing and relationship with God than the position itself. Then we look at, for example, David. David, after he was anointed, we see when he was at the front of the battle, at the front lines with the Philistines, and he heard Goliath taunting the Israelites. And we see the response of the king and the army of Israel, how that everyone was afraid. But David, when he heard this, he was really upset. He was upset because someone would dare to taunt the army of the living God, the nation of Israel. So he went and confronted Goliath. And that really made Goliath angry, because we know when David went, he wasn't wearing any armor. The armor that King Saul gave to him was too heavy, and he was uncomfortable in it because he wasn't trained in it. He didn't bring any of the weapons of war either. So having no armor is one thing, not even bringing the sword or the spear was another. So Goliath said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Right? It was an insult, right? And then the Philistine, the Bible records, cursed David by his God. And then David's response, 1 Samuel 17:45-7, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled." Then verse 47, "Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hand." So we see the faith that David had. Not king yet, but the faith that he had in God, right? And that was probably one of the characteristics that made him selected, right? Because he was an individual who knew that he could do incredible things if God was with him. He was not of his own ability. If he was, you know, flinging the stone from his slingshot, and maybe 98 out of the 100 times it would hit the target, there's a 2% possibility that he will miss the target. His faith in God would cover that 2%, right? God will make sure that shot is not the 2% that would miss, right? That's the kind of faith that he has. That if God is with him, even a giant, he can win, right? And we know at the end of the day, David was victorious, right? So again, the type of person that God chooses and can use is someone with the right heart. Even if we are ordinary, it's the inner man that God seeks. So let's be soft-hearted individuals who are receptive to God's teaching. Let's not let tradition and rituals or anything but God's word guide us. And let us teach exactly that. Let us also be courageous to know that God will lead us into the final spiritual victory against any adversity, against any life-threatening event, and anything that we think is too big and beyond our ability to handle. Let us not blame God, but be receptive and understand how things work in life. Sometimes calamities threaten the things that we have that are valuable to us. Sometimes our family members fall sick. What is our response? I've seen people in church blame God. How can this happen to me? I've been faithful to God. That's blaming God. You do not accept the reality of life. The nature and the world will run its course. Right? And sometimes we will fall sick. Sometimes accidents will happen because of carelessness of ourselves or others. But it's never, in that sense, directly attributable to God. So we should realize our place in the grand scheme of things, our faith, and what our actions do to our faith. Those are some of the things that I think we can learn from the book of Mark. We've got 5 more minutes. If you have any questions or comments, now would be a good time to share that. Sure. Yeah. 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 She was a virgin up to Jesus' birth, but she did not remain a virgin for her whole life. Right. So that much is incorrect in terms of the Catholic understanding. Thanks, Brother Alan. Anything else? If not, let's stand for a closing prayer.